Hi, and welcome everybody to Dinner with Jesus, a Bible podcast it's just about the Bible. No doctrines, no agenda. We're not mad at anybody or trying to prove any points. We just like reading the Bible, thinking a little bit, and then everyone can decide for themselves what this means to them. I'm John Fairless, your host for the series. Right up front, I want to admit I've been a Christian pastor for more than 40 years, and I've spent a lot of time studying the Bible. But I have a passion for everyone to know more about these great stories, and I've just seen too much arguing over meanings and interpretations and who's right and who's wrong. I'm afraid we've lost the art of just listening to the words themselves and hopefully discussing what we've heard with a few friends. That's really the point of our show. So let me say a word about the title of the podcast. It comes from the first set of stories we're going to read today. On a day when Jesus, one of the most famous teachers in history, regardless of your faith tradition or lack of one, was doing what he liked to do best, sitting at table, eating and drinking and talking about stuff, like a conversation. Another lost art, I'm afraid, but that's another story. So Jesus is sitting at the table, and he's surrounded by a lot of everyday type folks, as well as some of the more religious people in his community. He knew them all well, and they knew a good bit about him. And when the religious folks started grumbling about the everyday type folks having dinner with Jesus, he recognized a teachable moment and did what he did a whole lot of the time. He told them all a story. Now, I'll be back to talk through the story and the dynamics involved in this scene, but let's listen first to the story itself, which is always the star of the show here on Dinner with Jesus. Our narrator's a great lady that around here we call the best Jane you've ever known, Jane Trevor.
I'm reading from Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 10. Now, all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my lost sheep." Just so, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Or what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." Just so, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents.
Jesus told a lot of stories. He didn't really get preachy too often. He just told stories about everyday life and let the message work its way into the hearts and minds of those who were listening. The Bible is a book of stories by and about many other people as well. These stories are endlessly fascinating and they're filled with meaning. Actually, they're filled with multiple meanings in most cases. Our goal on Dinner with Jesus is to sit down with these stories each week and just listen and think together for a bit and see what meaning might emerge for us. As I said in the intro, I love these stories and I've spent a lot of time studying them. But we're not here for my ideas or my meaning. I want to do what Jesus did. Just let the stories speak for themselves. You'll find your meaning, which probably won't be exactly like mine or anybody else's for that matter, and that's okay. That's kind of the point. Luke 15, this chapter in the Bible where we're beginning, has 3 stories in it. We heard the first 2 today, and we'll come back for the third one in the next episode. I will tell you, it's one of the most famous stories in the Bible. But I digress. The setup for the story is important. The situation in which these stories were told is often tied to the meaning of the story, as it's intended by the teller. Jesus was part of a long-standing tradition of wisdom teachers, many of whom used this same storytelling technique to guide their students. We see on this day that Jesus was hanging out with people described as tax collectors and other outcasts. It's probably easy for us to imagine tax collectors as outcasts. Who likes paying their taxes, even today? But these guys were doubly looked down upon, as they were local citizens who worked for the occupying Roman government. They were seen as traitors, really, and had the power of the Roman army behind them, enforcing the collection of the taxes, which were pretty onerous, to say the least. And who were these other outcasts? Let's just say they were not the people that you were likely to find in the pews of the synagogue on Saturday or the church on Sunday. They were likely a collection of folks who enjoyed a good time, worked hard and partied hard, lived their lives, and often found themselves on the outside of societal expectations, especially where religion was concerned. The other part of the crew in this episode included Pharisees and teachers of the law. These were the rules guys of the day. Very conservative, very focused on doing what's right. They become visibly and vocally upset with Jesus, who was considered a rabbi, a religious teacher. And it's their disdain that sets the tone. This man welcomes outcasts and even eats with them. Now, not to dive in too deeply, but the food connection is important here. For the society that Jesus lived in, hospitality at the table was a big deal. General Middle Eastern culture provided that offering food and drink to a neighbor was an expected duty of those who had enough to share. The Jewish culture even had rules and regulations about how to do that, so that an observant Jew could offer the good deed without spoiling their religious purity before God. There were some expectations for keeping yourself separate from certain types of people and eating certain types of food. So it seems that Jesus wasn't observant enough, at least in this situation, with the rules and the regs for these religious followers who were watching him. As a holy man, they couldn't understand why he would gather with these unholy people, much less sit down at the table with them. Being the equal opportunity person that he was, we know that Jesus also spent time at table with the religious folks. Just one chapter earlier, in Luke 14, we read these words. One Sabbath, Jesus went to eat a meal at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, and people were watching Jesus closely. We kind of get the idea that maybe they were watching him closely to see if they could catch him messing up. So, in our story for today, with eyes and ears on him and the tension in the air growing pretty thick, what does Jesus do? He tells them a story. Actually, 3 stories. And this is where the fun begins. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. What do? Jesus gets everybody's mind activated by putting them into the shoes, or the sandals, I suppose, of a fairly well-to-do sheep farmer. What is the value of one lost sheep out of 100? Now, he'll go on and tell another story about the woman who has 10 silver coins, and she loses one of those. We know that each one of those coins was worth about a day's wages, so let's call it $150 or so in our terms. And again, the same question. What does she do? And so he's putting the listeners into her place. The third story, which we'll consider next time, begins by saying, there once was a man who had 2 sons. And so just like the first 2 stories, we expect to learn that one of them was lost. All 3 of these stories follow a similar format. There's something valuable. That something is lost. There's a search that goes on. And then there's great joy when that something is found. In the case of the sheep owner, once he realized the sheep was missing, he had some choices to make. He could have reasoned, well, I hate losing one sheep, but that's just the cost of doing business. I can't leave these other 99 and go out on a wild sheep chase. That's just not a good risk to reward ratio. Or he could have muttered about the nature of sheep and cursed the dumb animal for not respecting the boundaries of the sheepfold. Or he could have reacted in fear, thinking, if I leave the 99 to go out after one, a wolf could come while I'm gone, and then things could get much worse. Now, you gotta say those are all quite reasonable responses. And as Jesus' story continues, he says that the shepherd did do the foolish thing and go after the one, bringing it back and then calling his friends and neighbors together for a party to celebrate the sheep that was lost. He turns to the crowd and says, that's what you'd all do too, isn't it? And you can just feel a little shrinkage going on with the people thinking, yeah, I don't know about that. Seems kind of silly and wasteful. But after a remark about joy in heaven, he moves on to story number 2. Now, this is the woman and the coin, and she's just being careless enough to lose a coin, and she also has some choices to make. She could have berated herself for her behavior, told herself that she deserved to lose the money for being so silly, and just chalked the whole thing up to experience and said, well, I'll try to do better next time. Of course, she could have plopped down on the couch and hoped for a miracle. Maybe it'll turn up. Maybe someday I'll be able to find it again. I guess I'll just sit here and stew about it until it finds itself. Or she could get busy cleaning that house, moving every piece of furniture, shining the light into the dark, dusty corners until she finds it. And so that's what she does. And she's pretty happy too. She calls her friends and neighbors over for a party. There's joy to be shared. And again, we have a statement comparing that to joy in heaven whenever one sinner repents, which tends to be the focus of most sermons and lessons on these stories. But there's just one thing about that. The commentary line is not really part of the story. And when you think about it, there's not really any way for a sheep or a coin to repent. Sheep don't have enough sense or self-awareness. And coins don't just roll themselves away from or back into the coin purse. So there may be something else going on here with these stories. Next time, we're going to read the rest of the chapter with that third story about the father with 2 sons. Now, a little mathematical note. This just struck me. We started in that first story with 1 out of 100, right? 1 sheep out of 100. Then the next story took us to 1 coin out of 10. And finally, when we get to the third story, we're going to consider 1 out of 2. It's kind of like the stories are whittling down our focus and getting us to pay attention. So what do you think? What strikes you about these stories so far? I'd love for you to respond. You can leave a note in the comments section below. Give us your thoughts or your questions or your insights into the stories. And we'll see you next time on Dinner with Jesus. Dinner with Jesus is produced in the studios of the Lectionary Lab. Written and performed by John Fairless. Our Bible narration is by Jane Trevor.